As you know, a lot of people looking at the election of November 2020 and saying, what happened? Why did my guy not win? Why did my guy win? How did my guy win? How did we conduct our election? Joining us on the phone is the president of the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, Rick Esenberg. Hey, Rick.
Hey, how are you?
Good. So I understand that your organization released a report today, a long, lengthy report, which I've read some of it. I didn't read the whole thing, but I got to some of the conclusions that you reached. And I guess we'll start with this statement. It's almost certain that in Wisconsin's 2020 election, the number of votes that did not comply with existing legal requirements exceeded Joe Biden's margin of victory. That does not necessarily mean that Biden did not win a majority of the votes, but the questions of fraud and unlawful processes are related. Let's start with that. What does that mean?
Well, think of it this way. Think of two categories of votes. One category of vote would be what we would call clearly fraudulent. An ineligible voter voted. A made-up voter voted. A vote was manufactured that didn't exist. A vote that was legally cast was not counted. We found limited evidence of that type of thing, certainly not enough to change the outcome. We found many more instances of votes that were not lawfully cast. That is, some requirement for the casting of the vote, and it's typically an absentee vote, was not. The vote was handed in by somebody other than the voter, as the law requires. Drop box was used. The law doesn't specify drop boxes. The vote may have been corrected. There may have been a claim by the voters they were indefinitely confined, when it's very unlikely that all the voters who claimed to be indefinitely confined were indefinitely confined. That means they didn't show a photo ID. There was a failure to properly maintain the voter rolls, so that you had people who were voting who had failed basic data checks, which are done in order to confirm that the information that they give to registrars reflects the information that is on government records. And there were some problems with the impact of Zuckerberg money on the election. So all of these things occurred. They don't mean that the election results were wrong. They make it a little bit harder to be confident about the election results. But each one of them represents a departure from the way in which we agreed beforehand to conduct this election. And I think that's problematic in the context of an election, which is a zero-sum game. The rules need to be set beforehand, and the rules need to be rigorously followed so that everybody has confidence in the outcome.
So a couple clarifying questions. Did the pandemic and the administration of the rules, which I'm a rules guy, were not followed apparently? Are those two things related? Was it a one-of or unique situation that the pandemic created that maybe made it harder for those rules to be followed to the letter of the law?
Well, I think that with respect to various issues, you can make arguments of various strengths. For example, I don't know that it really was necessary to have drop boxes. I think that a lot of people who claim that they were indefinitely confined clearly were not indefinitely confined and really didn't have any basis to say so. The situation in nursing homes, where the way that the law says that the way that you have to vote in nursing homes is through sending in special voting registrars. At least at certain times in the pandemic, that would have been very difficult to do because they weren't letting anybody into nursing homes. So
right.
The pandemic, was all of this necessary because of the pandemic? I would say no. Was some of it perhaps desirable because of the pandemic? I would say that's possible, although here's the problem there. The Wisconsin Election Commission doesn't get to just change the law because there's a pandemic. It doesn't have the authority to do so. If it runs into a situation where because of the pandemic, it can't do something that the law requires it to do, then it has one remedy and one remedy only, and that is to go to the legislature and ask them to make a change. It cannot make the change itself because it's not a lawmaking body. I don't think, however, that this is all a one-off situation, because what we find now as we move towards 2022, all of these issues that were raised in the course of the pandemic still seem to be live issues. When people talk about limiting the use of drop boxes, when people talk about limiting the use of ballot harvesting, when people talk about limiting the ability of clerks to correct ballots or to voters to claim indefinitely confined status, there are some people who claim that we're now engaged in voter suppression, because whatever we did to accommodate the pandemic now becomes the new baseline. And even though we never did any of those things before and presumably had fair and open elections, eliminating them now is deemed to be unacceptable. So I think that these issues are certainly still live, and the reasons that we have these restrictions are still relevant.
Do you, in the course of your investigations, do you feel like these considerations, these interpretations, the ability to interpret the rules of voting could have been handled through normal legislative processes instead of the multiple investigations outside of the normal legislative process?
Well, and let's see if I can understand your question. I certainly think that it would have been possible for the legislature and the governor to reach some type of an agreement on accommodations in the election process in the course of 2020. They were not, neither one of them was apparently in the mood to do that, so that didn't happen. Now, subsequent to the election, there have been a lot of allegations. Some of these allegations, I think, had some merit to them, and these are the ones that we've been talking about. And incidentally, when we're talking about these irregularities, that doesn't mean that the election should have been invalidated. These issues were raised, or at least some of them were raised, by the Trump campaign in Trump versus Biden, which was argued before the state Supreme Court in December. The court concluded that the Trump campaign could not get votes drawn down because of the doctrine of latches, essentially argued that the Trump campaign had to have brought those issues up earlier, couldn't wait until after the election and bring them up there. So our report has nothing to do with whether the been invalidated. It only has to do with in a situation where there are all sorts of allegations of wrongdoing, which ones were true and which ones weren't. And as you know, having skimmed the report, there were allegations that were made post-election, allegations about vote dumps in the middle of the night in Milwaukee, and allegations about problems with Dominion voting software that we also looked at.
What did you find with the Dominion voting system? Just because that's a big one that people talk about.
Yeah, well, we found that Trump did better where there was Dominion voting software than where there was not.
How about that?
So, so we discount that. I understand why people thought that there was a vote dump in Milwaukee in the middle of the night. It seemed that way, and it seemed that way as a result of Milwaukee's central count process. But it didn't happen. In fact, I remember telling my wife at about 2:00 in the morning on election night that even though Trump had a significant lead, that it was quite clear based upon 2016 results that there were a bunch of votes in Milwaukee County that were still out there, had not been counted, and that when we woke up in the morning, the election was going to be virtually tied with one candidate a little bit ahead or another candidate a little bit behind, and that's exactly what happened.
You're somebody that looks at these things in depth. You're attorneys and you're all highly qualified at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty to look at things in a very critical fashion. When you look at the process of November 2020, given the pandemic, given the always close nature of these presidential contests in Wisconsin, any of it surprise you? I mean, it seems like this is the way these go, and we can tie ourselves in knots over this stuff, but at the end of the day, one side wins, one side loses. It's really the ability to deal with that reality that seems to be more in question than anything else, in my opinion.
Well, I think I would differ with you a little bit in the following sense. I don't think, there's this old phrase that I think stems back from the deposition of Richard III in England that necessity knows no law. I don't believe in that. I think that even when we have an emergency, even when we have a pandemic, it's necessary to follow the law. And if we have to make modifications, we have to make modifications. And I think what we saw in 2020 in so many areas is a refusal to do that, and then a failure of our political institutions to engage in the type of bargaining and compromise that would have been necessary to change the law. Everybody wanted it just the way they wanted it, and were, perfectly willing to sit on the sidelines and sort of allow chaos to ensue. And that's when organizations like ours had to, jump in and start filing lawsuits to enforce the law. It didn't have to be that way. And I think that's true with the elections as well, where I think that, we could have adhered more closely to the electoral process. And look, going forward, and again, the emphasis of this report is we wanted to look at what happened, because we have a society now in which there's two different versions of what happened in the 2020 election. There's the big lie version and there's the big steal version. And, the truth lies somewhere in between those two things. And I don't know if anybody will listen to us, but I think that we made a pretty good case that is where the truth lies, at least here in Wisconsin. And I think that it's important to understand that, so that then we can realize going forward that, we're not dealing with, we're not dealing with people that, excuse me, on the other side, that can't be spoken to. And we can start to talk about, how we might want to move going forward. So, for example, drop boxes would be a perfect example of this. If we think we should have election drop boxes, what happened in 2020 is because the law doesn't provide for them, WECPIC basically said that they could be anywhere where people gather, and they could be operated in any way. They could be supervised, they could be unsupervised. There's no particular chain of custody requirement. Well, maybe if we want to have drop boxes, we can specify that they will be in places where they will be under more or less constant supervision. We can specify that they'll be video monitored. We can specify that when the ballots are picked up, they will be counted, right? So we know how many, ballots were taken out of a box, and match that to the number of ballots that were then delivered.
But you know what that's going to require, Rick? It's going to require a conversation and compromise in some ways. And, we can go on and on about this stuff, but at the end of the day, if the governor and the legislator don't agree on these things, we're never going to get to any real solution on this stuff. And you always tell me this, that laws can be interpreted in different ways. That's why we have attorneys. That's why we have judges. So even election law is going to be interpreted by the Wisconsin Elections Commission, going to be interpreted by clerks, and then we end up in the same place we always do, which is in the courts. Or is that just the defeatist attitude?
Yeah, I mean, we can, but I guess I'm not wanting to be a defeatist about this. I mean, look, we had this example in 2020 with respect to, restriction measures where the court ended the lockdown, but the court did not say that the governor could not have stay-at-home orders. The court said that the governor had to proceed by rulemaking. Now, rulemaking would have been messy. It would have required public notice. It would have required public comment. It would have required a bit of legislative oversight. And we don't know how this would have come out. The governor started the process and then decided, well, these Republicans won't go along with me, so I'm not going to do anything. There's a time in the past when it wouldn't have worked that way. There's a time in the past when the Republicans and the Democrats would have decided that they're going to have a fight over this. And yes, they might not agree at first. It might be ugly, and there might be, speeches in which they denounce each other, and the public would watch that, and the public would weigh in, and ultimately the thing would be decided one way or another, rather than everybody simply sort of retreating to the most extreme position and then posturing about it instead of legislating. And I think that's the problem that we have today, where, it's, and this is not everybody, and there are many legislators, I think, who try to do a great job. But there is this tendency to think that the thing that you have to do is retreat to the position, which is the position of the most extreme members of your base, and then just sit on it and go on cable news and and proclaim. And it's my job to proclaim. It's not the job of a legislator to proclaim. It's the job of a legislator to actually do something.
Well, we got to tell those folks that's what they're supposed to be doing. Rick, thanks as always for your wisdom. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
Rick Esenberg, president of Wisconsin Institute for the Law and Liberty, and his comments on their investigation into the 2020 election. You heard his comments. What do you think? 855-616-1620. That's next.
You listen.